This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 4 of season 4 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, January 28, 1911, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mrs. Caroline Carlton Atwood recently observed the 90th anniversary of her birth. Aside from deafness, Mrs. Atwood enjoys fairly comfortable health for one of her years and is surrounded with the devoted care of her 3 daughters. The day was made memorable with remembrances of flowers and other gifts, and Miss Miranda Luce, with pleasant neighborly spirit, wrote some original verses for the occasion. Mrs. Atwood and her 3 daughters lived at 4 Graniteville Road. She also had 3 sons who I think all lived out of town, one of them in Florida and one in Chelmsford, I believe, and one somewhere else. At the meeting of the Grange last week, Thursday evening, Joseph Wall had arranging of the program, which proved very enjoyable. Everett Woods contributed readings and a character song. Mrs. Pearlie E. Wright recited most acceptably, and Miss Pond sang a solo and responded to a hearty encore with another. At the business session, some details were arranged for the coming Farmers Institute. At the next meeting, the program will consist of a mock trial titled The Great Plumber Breach of Promise Case. Plenty of fun is promised and a good attendance is desired. The Great Plumber Breach of Promise Case was mentioned here, was written by F.E. Woodward Merriman Fifield in 1902. Mrs. Edward Prescott observed the 80th anniversary of her birth on Monday this week. Greetings and messages from friends, flowers, and other gifts, and comfortable health made the day an enjoyable one for Mrs. Prescott. Master Gordon Seavey has been seriously ill with pneumonia, but as this writing is better, and if no new developments take place, his many friends hope to see him back to his usual sturdy, wholesome self. Little Walter Perkins has also had a serious attack of pneumonia, but is on the gain. Mrs. John Wilson remains very seriously ill at her home at the south part of the town. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas F. Fisher came up from Lowell and joined the Thimble Club last week in their surprise party for Mr. and Mrs. Woods. There will be a meeting next Tuesday evening at the Town Hall at 7:30 in the interest of village improvement. A good attendance is desired. A very good neighborhood prayer meeting was conducted by Reverend Mr. Wallace at the home of John McMaster at the East Village on Tuesday evening. The East Village was the area around Chamberlain's Corner at the intersection of Main Street and Chamberlain Road. Motorman John Sherlock's many friends are sorry to know that he is having a heart attack of erysipelas. Mrs. Herbert V. Hildreth is enjoying a visit with the Henry M. Wrights at Quincy, and Mr. Hildreth will join her for the weekend. The next section is the Tadmuck section. It was Children's Day in the Tadmuck Club Tuesday afternoon, a feature in this year's program that has not previously been observed and which proved a delightful success. The meeting was held in the pleasant parlors of the Unitarian Church, this change of meeting place being for the use of a piano and for greater facility in serving refreshments. Mrs. Bell Harrington Hall, always a favorite with the membership, entertained the children and young people, and incidentally their elders as well, with her selections. Her juvenile impersonations were charming, and her rendering of, quote, the little Chevalier, end quote, in serious vein was splendidly given. The novel The Little Chevalier was written by American author M.E.M. Davis in 1903. Mrs. Hall was supplemented in her program with singing by a chorus consisting of the following young ladies: Mrs. Evelyn Hamlin, Ethel Richardson, Pauline Wallace, Hazel Hartford, Hilda Isles, Adrith Carter, Lillian Sutherland, and Marjorie Seavey. These girls were all aged from about 13 to 15 years old. There was also a solo by Adrith Carter, a duet by Pauline Wallace and Lillian Sutherland, and piano and violin solos by Hazel Hartford and Evelyn Hamlin. At the close of the program, a club tea was served and a local social hour enjoyed. The committee in charge were Mrs. Homer M. Seavey, Miss Eva E. Fletcher, and Miss Winifred Burnham. Mrs. Seavey was detained at home by the serious illness of her little son, that's Gordon, mentioned above, who was aged 5. And in her absence, Mrs. J. Herbert Fletcher assisted most capably. There were fully 75 present. Next, we have the About Town section. Orders have been issued by George C. Moore, the owner of the sawmill and corn crushing establishment at Westford Station, to clean up, sweep up. Don't know what is coming. The popular quartet of Lowell, Edward Wirt, Harry Needham, Arthur Munn, and Andrew Howard, gave an entertaining concert at the Unitarian Church on Thursday evening. They rested from their labors while Mrs. Lillian Dodge Haskell of Lowell, as reader, demonstrated various funny phases of life. It was all a rare good outing. The Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher has been looking after his stone rights in the new stone post office at New Orleans. Our own substantial Oak Hill, both stone and man, are part of this new building, and Oak Hill honor and stone are in it elsewhere for the service of the people. The Wardsman will be found on sale each week at the store of Wright and Fletcher. This is now the building where Muffins on Main is located. Subscribers can pay their subscription to Alfred W. Hartford, who was the proprietor of the Wright and Fletcher store at the time, at the store, who will promptly attend to it. There is a beauty spot at Westford Center called Paradise. Another paradise has just been carved out at Westford Corner by the State Highway brush woodcutters in part of Brookside. Call and see us in our new dress and see if your easily spring millinery is not enchantingly stylish. This is near the home of the author, who is Samuel L. Taylor. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Whitney on the Lowell Road, who have been ill with a close alliance to pneumonia, have severed their alliance and have again allied themselves to the industrial duties pertaining to farm life. The Academy and High School will give a minstrel show at the Town Hall on Friday evening, February 3rd. The proceeds will be devoted to the undeveloped needs of the playground phase of school life. The next few paragraphs are titled Death. John H. Decatur died at his home on the Lowell Road last week, Friday evening, of pneumonia after an illness of only 4 days. 8 years ago, he was stricken with paralysis, which has been gradually weakening his physical endurance. In this weakened condition, he was a helpless prey to the encroachments of this added illness. During these many years of illness, he was compelled to relinquish active, stirring life so characteristic of younger, stronger days. Always cheerful and buoyant, full of courage and ready to try again, and never ready to spell give up, and these traits stood by him to his last conscious moments. By trade a carpenter, by choice and taste of later years a farmer. He was born in Lowell, being one of 9 children of Joshua and Mary Hill Decatur, being 74 years, 5 months old, and for 57 years he has resided in Westford, an interested citizen, identified with its life, with an always ready opinion and courage to stand by it for what seemed welfare's right-of-way. The funeral took place Sunday afternoon from his residence, Reverend David Wallace conducting the service. Several appropriate selections were finally rendered by Mrs. Clara Grieg and Edson G. Boynton. Relatives and friends were well represented, as their contribution of respect and the added and usual contribution of of the forever beautiful flowers. He leaves a family of 6 children: Charles of California, Burton W. of Springfield, Henry of Lowell, Albert W. of Westford, Mrs. Nancy A. Freyer of Groton, Mrs. Aurelia Wright of Westford. His wife, Nancy Wyman, died 19 years ago this January. Willard, the eldest child, died many years ago. Mr. Decatur, for a short time, was one of the older scholars in the Stony Brook School, and always part of the life of the district under the old school district system. Burial was in Fairview Cemetery. The bearers were Charles, Burton, Henry, and Albert Decatur, sons of the deceased. This obituary was undoubtedly written by his friend Samuel L. Taylor, the author of the About Town section of the newspaper. The next paragraph is entitled Entertainment. The Fortnightly Club held itself funny with its own well-trained efforts last week Friday evening. Arthur T. Blodgett, the president, called to order and then let loose the fun. Frog Hollow Lyceum, end quote, was presented, and among the actors who were musically talkative and kept the situation well keyed up with laughter were Mr. and Mrs. William Wyman, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Gould, Lillian Wright, Charlie Woods, Clarence Wyman. Several sidelights also illuminated the situation and sent it home with effect. Cornet solo, Arthur T. Blodgett, with Miss Lillian Wright as accompaniment. Reading, Mrs. Walter Wyman. Song, Mrs. Arthur T. Blodgett. Owing to the minstrel show at Westford next Friday evening, the next meeting of the Fortnightly Club will be held on Friday evening, February 10th, when it is expected DeLacy Corkum of Billerica will debate with those of his size or undersize, or else space off safe swinging distance and occupy the whole evening. DeLacy Corkum was well known in Westford. He was from Billerica, but was a popular local humorist in the area. The next paragraph is called Institute Meeting. The next Farmers Institute, given by Middlesex North, will be held in Town Hall, Westford, on Monday, January 30th at 10:30. The address of welcome will be given by Reverend David Wallace, response by Charles A. Kimball of Littleton. The address of the day will be given by Professor Sears of Amherst. Morning talk on how to prune fruit trees, afternoon talk on personal experiences in starting an orchard in Massachusetts. Music will be furnished by the Grange Orchestra. At the after-dinner speaking, Reverend Benjamin Bailey will be Toastmaster. When it is expected, the following gentlemen will respond: Reverend George Kengott of Lowell, George Forstall of Tewksbury, Frank Patch and Charles Kimball of Littleton, Reverend N.S. Hoagland of Tingsboro, Representative Edward Fisher, and Counselor the Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher of Westford. He's on the Governor's Council. The morning subject will be illustrated with several fruit trees placed in the hall, which the speaker will prune of all non-essentials. The next section is called The Prosperous Year. The report of the Westford Water Company has just been issued and shows the year to have been prosperous. The cash receipts were $6,112.06, expenditures $4,400.50, leaving a net profit of $1,711.56. During the year, 470 feet of 10-inch pipe has been laid in Graniteville, making the whole length of the pipe in the system 8 3/4 miles. 21 new water takers have been added during the year, making a total of 284. 4 new hydrants have been installed, 2 in the center and 2 at Ford's Village. 3 years of dry rainfall have proved the unfailing supply of water in the driven wells, its freedom from disease germs, and the above-par wisdom of those who installed this labor-saving, health-conserving convenience. Ford's Village is the next section. The Daniel Gage Ice Company of Lowell began the operation of cutting ice on Forge Pond on last Saturday morning and is certainly reaping a fair harvest this year. The ice is 12 inches in thickness and is of a fine quality, it being necessary to scrape off but a quarter of an inch before packing away. At the rate of speed in which the ice is being carried into the houses, 70 large cakes per minute, it will not be long before the work is completed, provided, of course, we continue to have clear, cold weather without snowstorms. Miss Catherine Brown of Bradford Street spent Sunday at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Mason of Lowell. Frederick Davis of Pleasant Street is still confined to his home by a very severe attack of the grip. That's what we would call the flu, influenza. Henry Catchpole, who has been ill, returned to work the first of the week. Mrs. Miles Collins, although much improved, is still under the physician's care. A social dance, which proved to be a thorough success, was held by the John Edwards Hose Company in Abbott's Hall last Saturday evening. Gilmore's Orchestra of Lowell furnished the music for dancing, which was enjoyed until midnight. During intermission, an excellent oyster supper was served. Cameron School was closed on Monday to give the teachers an opportunity to visit school in the vicinity of Boston. Mrs. John Carmichael, who has been ill with the grip, has recovered. The Hugh Daly of Pond Street, Mrs. Hugh Daly of Pond Street was called to Leominster during the week owing to the illness of her sister. William Precious has returned to work after an illness of a few days. The Ladies' Sewing Circle met in Recreation Hall on Wednesday afternoon at the usual hour. On Wednesday evening, the Girls' Friendly Society will meet in Recreation Hall, and a musical program will be enjoyed. The station of the Boston and Maine Railroad has received a new coat of paint, which very much improves its appearance. The next paragraph is called The First Time. At 10:30 o'clock on last Sunday morning, services were held in Abbott Hall for all the parishioners of St. Catherine's Church, West Graniteville, who reside in Forge Village. This is the first time Mass has ever been celebrated in Forge Village, and although it was held under rather rude surroundings, still it was thoroughly appreciated and enjoyed by a very large congregation. The hall was filled to its utmost capacity, many standing in the corridor. Reverend E.T. Schofield of North Chelmsford preached a very fine sermon. Sunday school in charge of Miss Abby Splain was held at 10 o'clock. Reverend M.E. Doherty will conduct the service on next Sunday morning at 10:30 o'clock. The next section is called A Persistent Hen. A curious incident happened to one of our best-known neighbors recently, which is well worth relating. A jet black hen had been making her abode in a shed belonging to the lady in question, and after being sent away time and again, had persistently taken it upon herself to return to her nest as previously. One morning our good friend, as her usual work demanded, went to the shed, and to her surprise found 5 white eggs laid in the nest occupied by the hen. Thinking things had reached the limit, our neighbor closed up the shed so that the hen would be obliged to find shelter elsewhere. Everything went on serenely for a time, when one morning our friend was called on a short errand and departed, leaving her back door ajar. On returning a few minutes later, she found to her utter amazement a beautiful snow-white egg laid in the center of her kitchen floor. Her friend, the hen, was not to be seen, but the result of her exploits was surely apparent. That's the news in Westford for the week ending January 28, 1911. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.